Saint Teresa's Ecstasy is immortalized in marble and prayer. But the archives reveal something else entirely: burns without fire, wounds without weapons, pain so severe she begged for death. For centuries, the Church celebrated her raptures while burying the medical testimonies that detailed her agony. The physical cost examines the evidence they never wanted examined. Her body became a battlefield. What we discover challenges every assumption about divine contact, because the truth is far more brutal than the statues suggest. The first accounts appear in letters she tried to burn. Teresa's own words describe sensations that don't belong in hagiographies: a piercing that left her gasping, unable to move, her limbs frozen in positions that shouldn't have been sustainable. The pain, she wrote, began at the moment of deepest communion, spreading through her chest like molten iron poured directly into her heart. These weren't metaphors. Her confessors recorded physical observations. Her body would stiffen completely, pulse becoming almost undetectable, skin taking on an unnatural pallor that lasted for hours after the ecstasy subsided. She would emerge from these states drenched in perspiration, shaking uncontrollably, often unable to speak coherently for entire days. The early Carmelite records document this pattern repeating across decades, each episode leaving her weaker, more damaged, less able to recover fully before the next divine encounter arrived. Medical witnesses from her own lifetime left testimonies that were quietly archived rather than celebrated. Doctor examinations conducted in 1565 and 1572 noted unexplained contusions across her torso, patterns of bruising that formed without external trauma. Her ribs showed signs of repeated stress fractures, the kind typically seen in bodies subjected to violent compression. Yet Teresa lived in a monastery, engaged in no physical labor that could explain such injuries. The physicians noted something else disturbing: burn-like markings on her chest that appeared and faded without clear cause, never quite healing before new ones emerged in slightly different locations. One doctor, commissioned by church authorities concerned about claims of possession, wrote that her symptoms defied natural explanation, not because they suggested divine origin, but because they resembled no known pathology. The flesh damage was real. The question was how invisible forces could leave such visible devastation. Between ecstasies, Teresa suffered what she called the wound that never closes. Contemporary accounts describe her clutching her chest, face contorted in expressions of agony that contradicted the peaceful imagery later associated with mystical union. Fellow nuns reported hearing her cry out in the night, not in prayer but in raw physical distress. The monastery kept detailed records of her incapacitation, days when she couldn't leave her cell, couldn't eat without vomiting, couldn't be touched without flinching from pain that seemed to radiate from somewhere inside her sternum. These weren't occasional incidents. They formed a relentless pattern spanning her entire adult life. The very experiences that made her a saint were slowly destroying the woman who experienced them. Her writings reveal awareness of this destruction. She knew each rapture brought her closer to a physical collapse she both feared and accepted as inevitable. The mysterious illnesses multiplied as her spiritual life intensified. By her 40s, Teresa's body exhibited symptoms that baffled every physician who examined her. Paralysis would strike without warning, leaving her unable to move for hours or sometimes days, yet leaving no neurological damage that doctors could identify. She developed extreme sensitivity to light and sound, spending weeks in darkened rooms because ordinary sensory input became unbearable torture. Her heart would race at speeds that should have killed her, then slow to rates barely sustainable for consciousness. Temperature dysregulation left her shivering violently in summer heat, burning with fever when monastery winters froze the well water solid. The pattern was clear to those willing to see it. Each major ecstatic experience was followed by a cascade of physical deterioration that conventional medicine couldn't treat, because it stemmed from a source conventional medicine didn't acknowledge existed. What the Church chose to emphasize tells us what they chose to hide. Official biographies written after her death focus almost exclusively on the spiritual content of her visions, the theological insights she received, the organizational reforms she implemented. They mention her poor health only in passing, framing it as generic feminine frailty, or the expected sufferings of a holy life. But the original sources paint a different picture entirely. They describe a woman whose body was being systematically broken by forces she couldn't control or refuse. Her confessor's private notes, discovered centuries later in sealed archives, reveal their horror at what they witnessed. One wrote that watching her during an ecstasy was like watching someone being crushed by an invisible weight, her bones seeming to bend under pressure that came from nowhere. Another compared it to witnessing a secret execution, the victim unable to escape, or even explain to observers what was killing them so slowly. The physical evidence remained even after her death. When Teresa's body was exhumed years later for the examination required for canonization, the investigators found something that complicated the expected narrative of incorruptible holy remains. Her skeleton showed abnormalities consistent with repeated trauma, fused vertebrae, healed fractures in patterns suggesting compression injuries, bone density irregularities in her sternum and ribs that shouldn't have existed in someone who lived a cloistered, non-violent life. Most disturbing was the condition of her heart. According to the official report, preserved in Vatican archives but rarely quoted in popular accounts, her heart tissue showed scarring consistent with repeated piercing or burning, centered on one specific location she had always indicated as the site of her mystical wound. The examiners couldn't explain it medically, so they declared it miraculous and moved on, leaving the implications of that physical evidence carefully unexplored in all subsequent teaching about her life and sanctity. Teresa herself provided the most damning testimony. In her autobiography and letters to confessors, she described the physical mechanics of ecstasy with clinical precision that religious scholars later tried to soften through metaphorical interpretation. But her language was concrete and specific. She wrote of feeling something like a golden spear or arrow being driven repeatedly into her heart. The pain so intense and so sweet simultaneously that she couldn't determine whether she was being killed or brought to impossible life. The penetration, she insisted, was physical, not symbolic, not imagined, but materially real, leaving her gasping and wounded when the angel or vision withdrew. She compared it to surgical procedures without anesthesia, to being burned alive from the inside out, to experiencing the precise moment of death extended across minutes or hours. These weren't poetic exaggerations. They were attempts by someone with limited medical vocabulary to describe sensations her body was actually experiencing. The neurological component reveals the mechanism behind the damage. Modern medical researchers examining Teresa's detailed self-descriptions identify symptoms consistent with temporal lobe epilepsy, severe migraine phenomena, and possibly a form of cardiac event brought on by extreme psychological and physiological stress. During ecstasy, her body was flooding with neurotransmitters at levels approaching toxicity, dopamine, serotonin, endorphins, and others in combinations that induced altered states while simultaneously causing cellular damage throughout her nervous system and organs. The euphoria she described wasn't separate from the pain. They were two aspects of the same biochemical storm. Her brain was essentially short-circuiting in ways that felt transcendent, because human neurology interprets certain kinds of overwhelming sensation as meaning and presence. But those same processes were causing microstrokes, damaging neural pathways, creating the chronic symptoms that plagued her between visions. The divine didn't need to be absent for the destruction to be real. Her confessors documented the physical toll with increasing alarm. Father reports from 1560 onward note Teresa's declining health in direct correlation with the frequency of her ecstasies. After particularly intense episodes, she would be unable to eat solid food for days, her digestive system apparently shutting down in response to the physiological trauma her body had endured. She lost dramatic amounts of weight during periods of frequent raptures, her already small frame becoming skeletal, despite the nuns' attempts to force nourishment. Her skin would break out in rashes and lesions that defied treatment, appearing suddenly after visions and healing just as mysteriously over subsequent weeks. Most concerning to her spiritual directors was the effect on her mental state. Following ecstasies, she would sometimes experience hours of confusion, memory loss, difficulty forming coherent sentences. They worried she was being damaged in ways that transcended the merely physical, that her mind itself was being reshaped or eroded by repeated contact with forces human consciousness wasn't designed to withstand. The wound in her heart became her defining physical reality. Teresa returned to it obsessively in her writings, this invisible injury that caused constant pain and occasional acute crises that left her collapsed and barely breathing. She described it as an opening that never closed, a vulnerability in her chest where the membrane between material and immaterial had been permanently torn. Medical examination during her life found nothing. No infection, no tumor, no structural abnormality that could explain the localized agony she consistently reported. Yet she would clutch that specific spot, unable to bear pressure or touch there, sometimes unable to lie on her left side because the pain became unbearable. Other mystics who spent time with her reported actually seeing her chest spasm and convulse during prayer, as though something were indeed piercing her repeatedly in that exact location. The nuns who prepared her body for burial noted that area of her chest was discolored, the tissue appearing somehow different from the surrounding flesh, as though marked by trauma that existed on a level conventional examination couldn't quite access. The cascade of strange illnesses followed a predictable pattern. In the days immediately after an ecstasy, Teresa would experience what she called the aftermath: extreme fatigue, muscle weakness so severe she couldn't hold a pen, vision disturbances that turned ordinary candlelight into unbearable glare. Then would come the secondary effects: fever without infection, chills without environmental cause, gastrointestinal distress that seemed neurological rather than digestive in origin. If too many ecstasies occurred in close succession, which often happened during periods of intense prayer or religious crisis, the damage would compound into something approaching complete physical collapse. Multiple times across her life, she reached states where death seemed imminent, her body shutting down system by system under strain it couldn't process or repair. She would hover in these near-death states for days or weeks, too weak even for the ecstasies that had brought her there, before slowly, inexplicably recovering enough functionality to begin the cycle again. Her body had become trapped in a pattern it couldn't escape. What she suffered between visions may have been worse than the visions themselves. The accounts speak of a woman in constant low-grade agony, punctuated by spikes of acute crisis. Teresa described it as carrying a wound that never healed but also never killed, a state of perpetual injury that nonetheless allowed continued life and function. She couldn't explain why the pain persisted when the source, the angelic presence, the divine contact, had withdrawn. Modern medical understanding suggests nerve damage, referred pain from damaged cardiac tissue, or chronic inflammation triggered by the repeated biochemical storms her body endured during ecstatic states. But to Teresa, living without modern frameworks for understanding her condition, it simply meant existing in unrelenting physical distress that no prayer or penance could relieve. The closer she drew to the divine, the more her body paid the price, not through temporary suffering that tested faith, but through accumulated damage that was slowly, systematically destroying her capacity to remain alive in the material world she was trying to transcend. The final decades show the trajectory clearly. By the time Teresa reached her 60s, her body was failing in ways that couldn't be hidden even by the most devoted hagiographers. She could barely walk without assistance, her legs giving out unpredictably as though the nerve connections to her lower body were intermittently severing. Her hands shook constantly. Making writing, the activity through which she documented her spiritual life, increasingly difficult and eventually nearly impossible, the illnesses that had always plagued her intensified into something approaching constant medical crisis. She developed what contemporary accounts call a tumor in her throat, making swallowing painful and speaking difficult, though no physical growth was ever confirmed by examination. Her heart problems, always present, became acute. Episodes where her chest would seize and she'd collapse, unable to breathe, convinced each time that this would be the fatal attack. She was dying slowly, and everyone around her understood that the ecstasies she'd experienced for decades had progressively destroyed the woman who'd hosted them. The Church made a calculation about what to preserve and what to suppress. Teresa's writings were edited after her death. Passages describing physical agony softened or removed entirely by religious authorities who wanted her mystical experiences to serve as inspiration rather than warning. Letters detailing her worst suffering were not included in early published collections. Confessors' notes documenting the medical catastrophes that followed her visions were buried in archives where they wouldn't complicate the narrative of blessed communion with the divine. What emerged in official biographies was a sanitized version. Yes, she suffered, but in that noble, inspiring way that saints suffer, purifying and elevating rather than destroying. The reality of her shaking hands, her paralyzed legs, her heart slowly being damaged by repeated mystical assault, her body literally breaking down under forces it couldn't withstand, these details were inconvenient. They suggested that divine contact might be less gift than curse, less elevation than consumption. Other mystics exhibited similar patterns, but their suffering was explained away differently for each one. When Catherine of Siena stopped eating and wasted away, it was attributed to holy anorexia, a spiritual discipline rather than a consequence of the ecstasies that ravaged her digestive system. When Hildegard of Bingen suffered debilitating migraines her entire life, historians focused on her visions and prophecies rather than examining whether the same neurological condition caused both. When Gemma Galgani developed stigmata and spent years bedridden with mysterious illnesses, the emphasis was placed on the miraculous wounds rather than on what it meant that receiving them destroyed her health entirely. The pattern appears across centuries. Women reporting direct divine contact consistently exhibit severe physical deterioration that conventional medicine of their era couldn't explain, and that religious authorities preferred to interpret as holy suffering rather than injury. Teresa's case is simply the most documented, her own writings providing evidence that later editors couldn't completely erase. The final journey revealed the cumulative damage. In 1582, traveling against her body's capacity to endure it, Teresa collapsed repeatedly on the road between foundations. Witnesses described her doubled over in pain, unable to sit upright in the carriage, occasionally losing consciousness entirely from what they assumed was exhaustion, but may have been her failing heart. When she arrived at her final destination, she could no longer stand unassisted. The nuns who cared for her in those last weeks reported that she seemed to be burning from the inside, her skin hot to the touch, though she shivered and complained of cold. She hemorrhaged internally, though from what source doctors couldn't determine. Her breathing became labored, each inhalation apparently causing sharp pain in her chest, that same spot she'd indicated for decades as the location of her mystical wound. She died as she'd lived, body racked with suffering that had no clear natural cause but showed clear correlation with the ecstatic experiences that defined her spiritual legacy. What the Church canonized was the vision, not the price. Saint Teresa became a doctor of the Church, her mystical theology studied and celebrated, her descriptions of divine union analyzed for their spiritual insight. But the physical reality, the wounds, the paralysis, the damaged heart, the decades of accumulated injury from repeated contact with forces human flesh wasn't designed to channel, remained largely unexplored in official teaching. It wasn't that the evidence disappeared, it was carefully preserved in archives, available to scholars willing to look. But it was separated from the main narrative, treated as unfortunate side details rather than central to understanding what actually happens when the divine, as conceived in Christian mysticism, makes direct contact with a human body. The cost was documented. It simply wasn't emphasized, because emphasizing it would require asking questions about whether that cost was acceptable, necessary, or even divinely intended. The investigation ends where it must, with recognition that transcendence came through destruction. Teresa's body was the battlefield, where matter and spirit collided with enough force to leave permanent damage. Her ecstasies weren't separate from her suffering, they caused it directly and measurably. The wounds were real, the paralysis was real, the heart damage was real. The mysterious illnesses that plagued her were consequences, not coincidences. She paid in flesh and blood and nerve damage for every moment of divine rapture, her body slowly consumed by the very experiences that made her holy. The physical cost isn't about diminishing her spiritual achievement. It's about acknowledging what that achievement actually required. The systematic breaking of a human being who couldn't refuse the force that was simultaneously elevating and destroying her. The statues show her in ecstasy, face upturned, body arched in apparent bliss. But they don't show what came after, when she returned to herself broken and burning, bearing wounds that would never heal because their source lay beyond the reach of any earthly medicine or mercy.